right, everyone. Welcome to the Yellow Chair Collective podcast. Today, I actually have a really amazing guest, Jaja Chen. She's an LCSW and an EMDR trained therapist, and she also trains us Yellow Chair therapists in EMDR. So why don't you give us a rundown about what EMDR is and how it works for people that don't know what it is?
Yeah, so EMDR is a type of therapy. It's a very long name. It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Such a mouthful, but EMDR for short. And it is a type of mind-body trauma therapy. So originally developed by Francine Shapiro in around the 80s. And it's a type of therapy that is different than just talking about trauma and the experiences that might be impacting individuals. Instead of just talking verbally about trauma in a therapy room, individuals who are going through EMDR therapy actually think of the memories or the experience, whether that's the thoughts, feelings, sensations, emotions, connected to difficult or traumatic experiences in their mind, similar to as if we're watching a movie in our mind. So instead of just verbally talking about what's happened, actually going through scenes and through the ways that our body physically can carry emotions. And so there's a lot more emphasis in EMDR therapy on how is trauma impacting us now and in our physical body and the ways that it shows up, as opposed to the exact content or material of what's happened or the details of what's happened in a trauma. And so a lot of folks will pursue EMDR therapy, especially if they've had past trauma or recent traumas and have not found as much relief or, haven't felt like the traditional talk therapy has help support, especially trauma responses or any kind of like post-traumatic stress response, anxiety, depression, or those types of experiences that can come because of trauma.
Interesting. So for the person who's listening to this, who's Asian American, who's living in an urban population, I'm thinking about this from the perspective of someone who has no idea whether or not they want to try EMDR. It's become such a hot button topic. Like I hear a lot of people talk about it, but I think the question I always get as a therapist is, when do I know that EMDR is right for me?
Yeah, so there's quite a few things, right? Because each person has different timing, when it comes to where your body's at too. So I would say EMDR is not for you if you're in a place where you're experiencing so much trauma responses and dissociation or dysregulation where it's hard,
Can you explain what dissociation is for people that don't know what it is?
So dissociation is where you're experiencing a lot of difficulty with just feeling present or grounded in the here and now. And that can be a trauma response. And this doesn't disqualify you from EMDR therapy, but if the level of dissociation is to a place where even being in a therapy office, right, is causing so much disruption and where it's hard to even, where you're working with an EMDR therapist and they're having a difficult time even being able to help support your nervous system. Before we jump into any kind of trauma therapy or EMDR therapy, we might have to work a bit more on just helping to develop more skills, to help our nervous system to be able to get a bit more grounded, a bit more present, focused, right? And so the idea behind that is we don't want to just jump straight into trauma therapy, right? And so I know a lot of people, especially if you've never done any kind of trauma therapy before, EMDR, you can feel eager, right? You read about it, you learn about it, you get super excited. You're like, yeah, I'm just going to go all in and just, uproot all this trauma. But I tell a lot of folks that, we have to also see, okay, where is our body at? And so it can be kind of frustrating, if we're like, okay, we're ready, but then our body might be like, nope, we might need to take it a bit slower, might need to develop a few more skills to be able to then support ourselves before beginning the process. So there's that.
Yeah.
And of course, if someone is just in a lot of mental health crisis, whether that's suffering through a lot of suicidal ideations or any of those kind of mental health crisis situations, we usually would not begin EMDR therapy at that point either, because EMDR therapy is a trauma therapy, like I said, right? And so the last thing we'd want to do if someone's in a mental health crisis is to, begin processing through further trauma.
So one of the misconceptions I always hear a lot as a therapist is if I just deal with this now, then I won't have to deal with it again. And what I mean by that is I think the slowing down process from the perspective of a therapist is necessary so that the client achieves longevity in their healing long term.
Sure.
And so for the person that's just beginning their therapy journey who has no idea about the why behind why we slow clients down, can you explain that? Because I think that a lot of the common themes are almost reversed. Like I just need to deal with the hard before it becomes easy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think even for some clinicians starting, earlier, there can be that misconception, right? Oh yeah, we just got to process through the trauma. But I think really seeing, once again, going back to your body, right? And the idea of we have to honor where our nervous system and where our body is at, and going harder for our nervous system is not going to actually be helpful. Similar to when we're working out our muscles, right? We have to have rest days. We can't just always push and push and push because we can get injuries. And it's really similar. It's the same kind of idea with our nervous system and trauma processing, pushing harder and pushing through it, even if we're really dysregulated, meaning, if we're experiencing like a panic attack in session or experiencing a place where it's like so disruptive, where we physically can't even feel present, that's not actually going to help support our nervous system and our mental health. That actually can make it worse. And so that's where, as a trauma therapist, we do have to help to slow down the process, right? And really take pauses, even when it comes to trauma therapy, and even as clients or even individuals who are going through EMDR therapy, not being scared to let our therapist know, like, hey, I need to slow it down, or I need to take some pauses, or I need to focus a bit more on grounding so that my body, can be able to feel a bit more safe. It really goes back to that place of safety and helping to make sure, right, that our body isn't in a place where we're dishonoring where it's at.
Yeah. You talk about the nervous system, and I think a lot of the listeners that listen to this podcast are immigrants who have just learned to push through. I'm a Filipina immigrant, and it wasn't until I started therapy that I started to understand how to listen to my body and what the nervous system was trying to tell me. The rapid change in breaths, and then the change in cues about how I feel about being in a crowded space. So when you talk about the nervous system, can you give me a couple of examples about someone that might be ready for EMDR and how their nervous system reacts to trauma?
For sure. So, for example, if someone's going through a lot of physical anxiety responses, right, whether that be unexplained tension or tightness, and that can oftentimes show up in things like headaches or migraines, and especially when it comes to situations, whether you're in a place or with a person or in settings that's reminding you of past or ongoing trauma, that can be one trauma response, right, in our nervous system, in our bodies, that EMDR therapy can help to resolve. Because EMDR comes from the perspective, right, that we have unprocessed memories and traumas that lead to different responses in the present. And so the theory is that if we process through these past experiences or the recent ongoing experiences, our brain, our nervous system is able to file away these experiences so that it doesn't continue leading us, right, to have all these different unpleasant responses in the present, whether that's the anxiety responses, nightmares, for example, can be a huge one that we can resolve with EMDR.
Yeah.
Flashbacks is another huge kind of area that a lot of folks might be dealing with or really impacted by in their day-to-day, right? Or where it's very disruptive. Like, for example, just going about your day and where you're just remembering flashbacks, meaning images or fragments, smells, any kind of sense of a past or ongoing kind of trauma or disturbing experience, right? And so those can all be different kind of areas that we focus on when it comes to EMDR, and those are just a few.
So, Jaja, how does like rapid eye movement like work? Because I guess I'm going to be EMDR trained like later on this year, but I'm curious, like, what's the science behind that? Like, how does that actually affect a person's ability to process through and process trauma? Can you explain the science behind it?
This is the part where it's like, oh, EMDR sounds very strange in this
right?
sense.
Yeah, it sounds more woo-woo for someone listening.
The eye movement, or also some therapists would say bilateral stimulation, meaning any type of movement or stimulation to help the left and right brain to be sparked, right? And so eye movement, or EM of the EMDR, is the most kind of standard practice to begin with, but there are other options as well, especially because for some people, eye movements might trigger, onset of migraine or headaches or whatnot. But basically the idea behind it is a few ongoing kind of theories or research that's being continuously kind of looked into. There's one theory that is like a working memory theory, the idea that sparking the left and right side of the brain kind of exacerbates the working memory and then leads to better integration of the trauma in a way that's different than if we didn't have the bilateral kind of eye movement. Other types of movements would be, there's buzzers physically that can buzz left and right to activate in your hands.
Buzzers.
There are what's called a butterfly tap, where we tap left and right on our chest with our hands, or sometimes with children or youth, even their parents or caregivers or guardians might even tap on their shoulders left and right. If we're doing telehealth, there are now apps and integrations in online telehealth to look at a ball that goes left and right, or even there's the tones that are left and right. There's so many different types of bilateral, but it's the idea that if we activate the left and right side of the brain, there can be better integration of the trauma, because while we are thinking of the trauma or the memory that you're trying to process through, you're also having to focus in on the eye movements or the bilateral. And that then helps to lead to better trauma integration than if you only were just verbally talking about it. Another theory that's still kind of being looked into is some researchers are considering whether or not our brain does something similar in EMDR, like REM sleep. I usually kind of hold more of the working memory dual attention kind of theory, but there's another side that also considers, is it sparking similar kind of processes in our brain, like REM sleep does, where we're integrating all our different day-to-day dreams and experiences in our memory.
I'm just really grateful that I'm learning all of this from you, because selfish reasons, I really appreciate this information as a therapist, because you hear these terms thrown out a lot: bilateral movement, you hear the nervous system getting regulated. We talk about the importance of just knowing your body. But I think that, these aren't tools that we learn in school. We're not taught to listen to our body.
Yeah.
Right. And so for you as a therapist, when you're taking in what's called vicarious trauma, hearing another person's trauma and helping them process, how do you help yourself as like a therapist in practice?
Yeah, it's so good. And, I think one thing I love about a lot of the mind-body kind of therapies, EMDR being one of them, is that because we don't have to talk about as many details of the traumas, that's one preventative measure already. Just
Wow.
practicing EMDR therapy actually prevents the vicarious or secondary trauma because the therapist won't have to hear as many of the details, because it's going back to the idea of the neuroscience, right? It's okay, trauma is not just the words or the thoughts or the experience verbally of what's happened. It's within our body, right? Trauma impacts our body. And so each person knows, or eventually as you continue in therapy, will get to better know how the trauma is held in your body. And so then you are the expert, right? And so then the contents, right? All the details of what's happened is not as big in the sense of like the therapist might not even need to know all the details to be able to help support you in
Wow.
processing. And that's the cool thing, because it's like, you know, especially if folks have gone through, earlier I mentioned the word dissociation, right? Like where severe dissociation could be blackouts or completely blocked memories, right? Or where you don't have all the details of a memory.
Wow.
And a lot of people might have discouragement of wondering, can they ever get relief or be able to support themselves, you know, if they don't know exactly what's happened. Or maybe if you're really young, right? As an infant, you don't necessarily have all the memories of what's happened, but you know of possibly what's happened when you're younger. But we can still help support individuals through traumas like that, even without all the details. And so that's one preventative measure, right, for vicarious trauma. Another thing is, I think, because so much focus is on the body, we as a therapist also has to be aware of where is our body at in the very moment as we're leading folks in EMDR processing, even before, after session, being aware of, okay, how am I absorbing or holding onto anything I've, you know, heard or even experienced in this session with folks, to have awareness of that. And then we too can utilize tools, you know, it's not that we're doing EMDR therapy to ourselves, but you can do, you know, butterfly taps or deep breathing or other supportive tools to be able to help support even after session, right? So that it's not to a place where we're physically then holding on to those traumas we're hearing, and then it just contains away and we, you know, just move on in our life, and where it just continues building up over time, right?
I think you're mentioning a school of thought that's just recently being discovered now by science, but I think a lot of spiritual practices have acknowledged for a really long time. And you talk about this thing called the mind-body connection.
Yeah.
And like I used to read Carl Jung when I was in social work school, and he talks about this, that like oftentimes our nonverbal communication has a lot to do with how our mind is interacting with our body. And when people hear about things like butterfly taps on Instagram, or when we talk about and psychoeducate people about this, the first thing that I often hear people talk about is how it's so woo-woo. Like, how does this affect the body? How does, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I really admire that you talk about the neuroscience behind it. And I think that it's just so interesting. So let's say that I'm going to give you a scenario. Let's say that you get a client who really wants EMDR and they're dissociating and they're just having panic attacks in session, but they eventually want to get there. They want to get to EMDR. And so what's the process that you take them through to eventually get to that point? What does that look like?
For sure. Yeah. I know earlier I said we might not be able to just begin, right, the trauma processing immediately, but that doesn't mean we cannot begin the EMDR therapy process in the sense of we can begin preparation work, right? And some of what that might look like is, you know, helping clients to be able to start to identify, what are potential triggers or even signs that your body is moving into a place of panic. Maybe even just starting to learn more about, those moments or throughout their day to day, when that's happening, and then supportive tools to help, so that instead of having to continue, repeated panic attacks, it's like, okay, how can we help to support your body, to manage those situations or those times. And so a lot of the tools where a lot of different EMDR therapists might incorporate might be things like mindfulness tools, different grounding or deep breathing tools, working on even just starting to identify, okay, when your body has specific responses, are there specific emotions that's connected to those responses, right? And for each person, that could be very unique to their body, where they're at. And so building more of that vocabulary even can be huge, and the awareness, right? We also work on something called resourcing. And resourcing is where we identify supportive people, places, maybe even animals, figures, role models, any kind of supports, right, that you can think of in your life, identifying who those individuals, people, things, places are, and then beginning to use some of the bilateral, those eye movements or the buzzers or the butterfly taps, to be able to have a felt sense of those resources. Right, because people that we find to be really supportive, or animals that we find to be really supportive, we don't just logically think in our head, oh, they're so great, right? It's like you can imagine who they are, you can think of who they are, and when you think of being with them, there can be a felt sense within our body, right, of support or care or encouragement, right? And so we practice that encouragement, right? That sense of support, not just in our head, but actually physically have clients hold that sense of support within your body, notice that, and then pair that with the bilateral. And so this is not beginning EMDR therapy processing where we're trauma processing, but this is preparations to begin the process in the sense of starting to identify some more supportive tools, supportive folks, and then eventually what happens is, these resourcing will help our nervous system to be able to better regulate, to better get back to the present. Two, these are going to be potential supports that incorporate into the trauma processing as well. So eventually, once we do begin trauma processing, we might draw from some of those supportive figures, people, places, images, even animals at times. So because for so many people, right, trauma was traumatic because there might not have been the supports that you needed in those moments or those times. And so we're not changing the past or changing memories, but we can draw from supports in the present to bring back some of that, to help our nervous system then to be able to integrate and to kind of catch up, in, if you will, in the sense of see it as like, oh, okay, yeah, these experiences are in the past, or that, that a more supportive place now.
Wow. The first thing that came to mind while you were explaining that is you remind me of my favorite eye doctor. I was, when I was growing up, what I really appreciate about therapists and healthcare professionals is how gentle we are when we talk about this. Because I think what can happen for so many clients, and what I think I'm learning to slow down about, because I'm only 2 years into this practice, is that I can give them so much trauma by, that's a really strong word, feelings of anxiousness, by overwhelming them with too much information. And so after attending some of your consultations, I really appreciate how you emphasize this importance of slowing down the client and helping them understand the why behind how to understand their nervous system so that they can get there.
Oh, for
Were
sure.
you always really good at training people? Did you have this like teacher spirit, or how did you get to that place?
I think I've always loved teaching and mentoring others. Probably, I look back, since probably like first grade, since the first grade I was on the, at that point in my elementary school, there was something called safety patrol, where the little kids would be wearing these little badges and being able to help other kids walk across the street.
You were that kid.
Yeah, so I was the kid that would be helping other kids, cross the street,
awesome.
Make sure the cars are not running kids over, whatnot, in first grade. And so I think from a really young age, just wanting to be able to help support others, lead, of course, when I was younger, I would be called bossy and whatnot. But as I grew
Me too.
older, realizing that, hey, being bossy, especially as a girl, is actually being a leader, and that's okay.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I definitely think that has been part of who I am for a long time. But definitely when it comes to that philosophy that you kind of shared of really honoring our nervous system, I would say it didn't really develop until the last 5 years or so. Because when I first started as a clinician, I think I just got super, kind of like eager to just get with it, when it came to helping clients to just go straight into their trauma processing and whatnot,
Wow.
and maybe even just naive in thinking when it came to what EMDR could be for folks. But then especially after going through more trauma sensitive mindfulness trainings and just having a lot more experience as well, realizing, oh, okay, we have to really start where each person's unique nervous system is at, not what we as a clinician thinks that we need to help support clients in.
Yes. Yeah, because it makes sense why, because I fell into that trap as well, and I'm slowly getting there. But one of the things that I've realized while you were saying that, the naivete that comes with when a client presents you with the problem, their historical things that they've gone through. And we can dive into that later on, or maybe at a second part of this conversation. But it makes sense because 2 + 2 = 4. And so if a client comes in with this problem and they want to fix this problem, the logical reason is to help them with the problem. But therapy is not math. There's so much nuance and gray that goes into a human interaction. There are the nonverbal cues. And I've even noticed that sometimes the client doesn't have the tools to tell you that it's too much, where they might cancel sessions, or they might be almost avoidant of coming to therapy or decrease the frequency of sessions. And as for people that are therapists listening to this podcast, like, what advice would you give them about bringing up the conversation if they do notice this?
Yeah. I think it's huge, right, for us as therapists to really be cognizant that we might be like eager, right, for clients to begin trauma processing, or maybe even clients would be like eager, right, to begin trauma processing. But in the end, it's like we each have to really kind of discern through and see, okay, it's not about our agenda or what we want to see happen, but really it's, okay, where is that client's, their body, their nervous system at, and helping them to also build a sense of compassion, even, right, for their bodies, if they're at a place where it's like, okay, we can't really just jump straight in like you might have wanted to from your therapy, right? And so definitely seeing that, and I think even just starting as a therapist to see that progress, right, is not linear. Healing's not linear for trauma.
That's
therapy.
So good.
There's so many layers, right? And so even as we help clients to get to a better place, maybe a few years down the road, they might be back because there's another layer of grief, another layer, right, that comes up. And that's very common at times. Doesn't mean that folks are not healing, but it's the fact that, okay, there can be different waves, right, and different layers when it comes to trauma healing in particular, especially if folks have gone through extensive, ongoing, or complex trauma, meaning, like extensive childhood trauma, for example, or experiences where it wasn't just a one-time situation or a single event.
I was going to ask you that. How do you define healing is not linear? But I think you answered my question, that when you process your understanding initially of trauma, there's always going to be something that comes up, or there's going to be something that the therapist might see that you might not have seen. I'm curious, like, what helps you continue this work? Because the work that we do is not easy. As therapists, we have to, every case is different. Every client is different. And as an EMDR therapist, as a trauma-informed mindfulness-based therapist, there's a lot that you can take in. And so what's your purpose behind why you continue to do this? And for the listener that might not know Jaja, she lives in Texas. And so there's another layer of racial trauma that she also works with clients on. And yeah, that's my question, Jaja. Like, what gets you going? How do you not give up
Yeah,
in this work?
yeah, my why. There's so
Yeah.
many shifts over the years because I think when I first began over 7.5 years ago as a trauma therapist, my why was like, okay, I'm going to help people, and that's about it.
Yeah, yeah.
Or just
Did
like
you live in
maybe
Texas?
more of like like I said earlier, like a naive view of like, okay, this is what it looks like. But I think over time it started shifting, especially when I began in private practice. My
Mm,
why became more about uh, helping to bring about more representation and just the need. Seeing, I'm in Central Texas in particular, where there's a
Central.
lot of gaps
Did you
in
always live
services.
there?
Yeah, I've been in Waco for over 11 years. And so being in Central Texas, there's a lot of gaps in services, and especially when it comes to services for BIPOC or, or just people of color in general. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, at that time, I was the only Asian American therapist that I knew of in Central Texas area. Um,
Wow.
so Austin and Dallas is about an hour and a half away, but yeah, of
Mm-hmm.
course, telehealth really opened up, a lot more opportunity. But 7.5 years
Yeah.
ago, not as many people were doing telehealth, and so I
Yes,
think
yes.
me entering into this field was just seeing the need, right, for more inclusive therapy,
Mm,
and especially seeing the need for folks to be able to find therapists that not just look like them, but also had an understanding of more diverse cultures, and practice right from that lens in a way that's a lot more inclusive. And so that's really what has sparked me to continue, because especially in the midst of the pandemic and with the rise of racial inequities and racial injustice and concerns in our society, I think that just continues to be my why of, okay, I'm going to continue in the field, because we need to have more diverse inclusive therapists, right, that are
mm-hmm.
really not just trauma informed, but also um, from the populations that we're wanting to serve.
Yeah. Without without disclosing any specific stories, like when you think about your work, what what cases are the most fulfilling to you? Which ones do you gravitate more towards?
Yeah, like I love working with birth trauma, which is something that I had never anticipated
Wow.
would come
How
out
did that
of
happen?
my experience, because one, I'm not a mom, I'm not a parent,
Uh-huh.
but really emerged from my experience working with domestic violence survivors. And that was where I began my journey as a social worker. And then working in that context made me realize a lot of folks were going through perinatal mental health concerns too, and postpartum mental health. And I was working with primarily BIPOC populations.
Mm,
And with that comes a lot of concerns too, with medical trauma, racial medical trauma, which then can lead to birth trauma. And so that's really where all of that emerged in that experience. And then once I entered into private practice, started to get more training for working with perinatal mental health, and then realized like I love working with parents and with individuals who've gone through
yeah.
um, medical or birth related traumas, and to help them through, perinatal or postpartum PTSD, trauma responses, all of that. I also just love working in general with individuals who've gotten to a place where they just feel like they've tried therapy so much, but then it's just, they felt kind of disillusioned, by the therapy, whether it's because they haven't really found therapists who, really took their ethnic roots, their background into consideration, or
Mm,
because of just a lot of extensive trauma, not being able to find folks, who are as trauma sensitive or informed. So those individuals are definitely folks that I love serving as well.
that's so good. That's so good because I I don't know why, but I enjoy working with, actually I know why. But I think that a lot of BIPOC folks have experienced a lot of CBT type of work where they
Yes.
learn to logically think through their trauma. But there's another layer that is not typically explored, which is what happens in your body, despite it happening
Oh,
2 years
sure.
ago, despite it happening 10 years ago. there's triggers that often occur that like
Yeah,
logical thinking doesn't explain. And so
for sure.
mindfulness-based thinking, trauma-based thinking, I'm really loving emotion-centered type of therapy because it validates the person's experience in a new way of thinking, don't you think?
For sure, for sure. Yeah. And of course, CBT can be really effective, right, for certain
Yeah.
concerns like OCD or anxiety, but there's also limitations to of CBT when it comes to racial trauma, particular or ongoing
Mm,
trauma, right, where it's not always just resolved, or
mm-hmm.
especially if the trauma impacted folks' body in particular.
A good point. Yeah. I want to be respectful of your time, Jaja, because we have about 4 minutes left in our interview and you're a busy lady. But um, my last question to you is like, are there any resources you recommend, favorite books? It doesn't have to be specific to EMDR or neuroscience or brain chemistry, but work that has really impacted your why and why you
Oh,
continue to
yeah.
do
Oh,
this.
yeah. Yeah, one
Yeah.
of my favorite books, especially on the idea of, trauma in our bodies, is by Resmaa Menakem. And he's
Mm.
a social worker, and he has a book called My Grandmother's Hands. My Grandmother's
Ooh.
Hands. And it's on healing racialized trauma in the body. And the cool thing about this book is it's super practical. So for those listening or tuning in, whether
Yeah.
you are just an individual curious about mind body therapies or a clinician or therapist, or just wanting to learn more, I definitely would say that would be a must read, for all individuals that are wanting to learn more, because each chapter has actual practice exercises, similar to what we were talking about earlier about resourcing, right?
Mm.
He goes through a lot of different practical resourcing exercises, which for anybody can be really good supports at home or in your own time to help to manage trauma responses. That one's
That's
one of
so
my
good.
favorites. And then, another one of my favorite books, I would say, especially when it comes to this whole, kind of journey of um, integrating trauma in particular. I don't have it. Am I allowed to like go get it really quick so
Yeah,
I
you
can
can
see?
go get it. Please, please, please.
I don't have it next to me, but it's right here.
Listener, for those of you that are just tuning in, Jaja is getting her favorite book so she can show us. So,
So this one right here is called Restorative Yoga for Ethnic and Race-Based Stress and Trauma. And
ooh,
it's by Dr. Gail Parker, and she's a licensed psychologist and certified yoga therapist. And so
oh,
she goes through a lot of different practical experiences and also restorative yoga tools. And so this one is really powerful, especially because it integrates a lot of not just research, but also practice and case scenarios. So there's that
so good.
one. And then last but not least, trauma sensitive yoga and therapy is
Ooh,
another one. It's by Dr.
trauma
David
sensitive.
Emerson.
Ooh, okay. I'm gonna
Yeah,
buy
so
these on Amazon.
even if folks are not yoga instructors or practice yoga, a lot of the tools of yoga integrate a lot of times with trauma sensitive work. There's a lot of overlaps, and so then starting to learn more about it oftentimes will connect a lot with any type of mind body therapy, EMDR work. You'll see a lot of overlaps.
Mm. Jaja, thank you so much for your time. I really
Yes.
appreciate it. I've been taking notes during the span of our interview, and I just want to acknowledge you. You carry a presence of calm and patience that I really admire. It's one of the reasons why Sujin and Linda wanted to have you on the podcast. You have such a teaching spirit, and the resources that you provide are so specific to the population that you want to serve. And so I really do think that this episode is going to serve people.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah.